Chapter 19. Martyrs of Lyons and Vienne. This season of peace to the Church ended with the death of Antoninus Pius. He was succeeded by Marcus Aurelius, who was a Stoic philosopher and prided himself on being too wise to have much feeling, or to be glad and sorry like other people. He has been considered a pattern of pagan virtue, and in some respects he was better than the people around him. But when he is compared with Christians, he appears to be very proud and selfish. The Christians left their homes and gave up all they loved best in order to preach the gospel to strangers and to save them from going to hell. But Marcus Aurelius allowed his own wife, his son, and many others of his family and friends to lead most horribly wicked lives, because he would not take the trouble of checking them and would not disturb the peace of his own mind by caring about their wickedness. Marcus Aurelius was very proud of his own learning and wisdom, and so the Christian religion was too humble and simple a religion to suit him. He hated the Christians, and they were cruelly persecuted during the whole of his reign. No new law was passed against them, but as soon as it was known that the emperor hated them and would not be displeased at any injustice that was done to them, the edicts of Adrian and Antoninus Pius were disregarded, and the church was given up to the fury of savage mobs and bigoted magistrates. Several popes, one after the other, suffered in this reign, and Christians were martyred in all the provinces from one end of the empire to the other. There has come down to us a letter which was written at this time, and which gives a most interesting account of what befell some of the Christians in Gaul, by which name France was then called. It is from the churches of Lyons and Vienne to their brethren in Asia and Phrygia. The writers begin by saying that it is impossible fully to describe the greatness of their own sufferings and the madness of the heathen against the Christians, because their great adversary, the devil, had attacked them with his whole strength. He began by gradually exciting his servants against the Christians, so that they were shut out from the houses of pagans, and from the public baths and markets, and everything belonging to them was prohibited from being seen in any public place. But the grace of God was with them, and these trials only served to prepare them for the greater ones which were at hand. Before very long, the populace proceeded to violence against them. Their houses were plundered, their goods were carried off. They were hunted down with furious cries, and were beaten and stoned, and given up defenceless to bear all that a savage mob could inflict on them. Several of them were seized, and after being examined by one of the inferior magistrates, they were thrown into prison till the arrival of the governor, who happened just then to be absent. On the governor's return, they were taken before him, and were treated by him in the same cruel way as they had been by the mob. The unjust treatment they met with was so evident that Vettius Epagathus, a young man of high rank, who was secretly a Christian, filled with indignation and forgetting the danger to which he was exposing himself, demanded to be heard in their defence, boldly declaring that they had done nothing against religion and the laws. A loud cry from the mob rose in answer to his words, but the governor quickly cut the matter short by asking him whether he also was a Christian. Epagathus confessed in a clear voice that he was, and instantly he was placed among the martyrs, while the populace hooted him, calling him contemptuously the advocate of the Christians. He and his companions were then led to torture. Most of them bore the tortures with great constancy, but 10 of them, whose faith was weak, could not stand out against the intensity of their sufferings, and to the great grief of their brethren, They were tempted in an evil moment to give in and offer sacrifice to the gods. The others, including Epagathus, died amid the tortures, confessing Christ and rejoicing at dying for him. The persecution did not end with the execution of these first martyrs. Some heathen slaves who lived in Christian families were seized and brought before the governor, and, on being questioned, they accused the Christians of eating human flesh, of sacrificing little children, and of committing other crimes too horrible to mention. Up to this time, several of the more respectable pagans had not joined in the persecution, because some of the Christians were their relations or friends. But after these fresh accusations became generally known, all ties of blood and friendship were forgotten, and the whole population seemed only to be vying with each other who could be most cruel to the Christians. Then was fulfilled our Lord's prophecy. The hour cometh, that whosoever killeth you will think that he doth a service to God. Every day more and more persons were seized and thrown into prison, till at length all the principal members of the churches of Lyons and Vienne were collected there. The bishop, Pothinus, was more than 90 years of age, and he was so infirm that he could scarcely breathe. But he longed so for martyrdom that he roused his little remaining strength and had himself dragged before the judge. Though his body was nearly worn out, partly by age and partly by disease, yet he still retained enough of life in him to suffer for Christ. When he was carried before the tribunal, he did not shrink from the blows and clamour to which he was exposed, and on being asked by the governor who was the God of the Christians, he answered, "If thou art worthy, thou shalt know." After this he was dragged away and mercilessly scourged, while those of the mob who stood near him kicked him and struck him with their hands and feet, and those at a distance pelted him with stones and filth, till at last he was thrown almost dead into prison, where he expired at the end of 2 days. It would be endless to narrate all that the martyrs suffered. They were thrown into the darkest and most dismal dungeons. They were stretched in the stocks till their limbs were out of joint. Some of them were so tortured that they were kept alive only by the supernatural strength of body and mind which God gave them, and numbers of them who had been rich and had not been accustomed to hardships died in prison from suffocation and want of the commonest necessaries of life. 4 of the martyrs were more particularly distinguished by their constancy and their sufferings. These were Sanctus, the deacon of Vienne, Maturus, a recent convert, Attalus of Pergamus, a Roman citizen of high rank, and Blandina, a slave. Maturus and Attalus suffered the usual tortures, all of which they bore with great firmness. As Sanctus was a deacon, the pagans were very anxious to conquer him, or at least to make him say something he ought not to say. So while he was being tortured, they kept on asking him all sorts of questions. But he saw what they wanted, and was determined to disappoint them. And so he would not tell them what his name, or his nation, or the city whence he came, or whether he was a slave or a freeman, but answered them only with the words, "I am a Christian." This confession was to him instead of name, and city, and race, and every other thing, and no other word was heard to pass his lips. Then there rose a diabolical contest between the governor and the tormentors, to see who could invent the most horrible tortures for him. Till at last, when all their ingenuity was exhausted, and they did not know what else to do, they fastened red-hot plates of brass to the most tender parts of his body. But through it all, he continued unmoved, firm in his first confession, "I am a Christian," and constantly refreshed and strengthened by the fountain of living water which flows from the heart of Jesus. By this time, his whole body, from head to foot, was one great wound, and it was so mangled and shriveled that it had no longer the form of a man. It needed but a little more to set him free, but his cruel tormentors denied him this little, for just as he seemed to be on the point of expiring, they stopped the tortures and sent him back again to prison. After a few hours, when they supposed he had recovered a little strength, they brought him out again, and prepared to put him once more to the torture. His wounds were now so swollen and inflamed that the tenderest touch of the softest hand gave him excruciating pain, and they thought that if they were to repeat the former tortures while he was in this state, he must either give way under them or die, and his death would at least strike terror into others. But the supernatural power of Christ, who dwelt and suffered in him, now appeared in such a wonderful way that the devices of the devil were defeated, and his fellow sufferers saw plainly that there is nothing terrific where the love of God dwells, and nothing painful where the glory of Christ reigns. For when the tortures were applied a second time, his body, which just before had been a shapeless mass, suddenly resumed its accustomed form. His limbs recovered their natural strength. He stood erect, and was able to endure all that was inflicted on him, so that, through the grace of Christ, these second tortures, instead of being a torment, became the means of curing him. As for the slave Blandina, she had always been a gentle and unpretending person, and had never said much about her love for Jesus, or about her readiness to suffer martyrdom. When she was seized, the rest of the Christians, and especially her mistress, who was herself among the martyrs, were afraid that she would not have courage or strength to stand firm. But she cherished in her heart a deep though secret love to Jesus, and he, in return for this love, filled her with such supernatural power as made it evident that he prizes most the things which appear mean and contemptible to men. Her tormentors inflicted on her all the usual tortures. They racked their brains to discover new and unheard of modes of suffering. They took her in hand by turns, relieving and succeeding each other from morning till night, but all in vain. This blessed saint seemed to gain fresh strength and courage by constantly repeating, "I am a Christian. No wickedness is carried on among us." These words appeared to refresh her and to ease her pain. At last, her tormentors confessed that they were fairly beaten, for they knew of nothing more which they could do to her. It was only a wonder, they said, that she continued to breathe, after her whole body was thus pierced and torn asunder, since one single torture such as they had inflicted on her was enough to have killed her. The public games were now about to be exhibited, and, on the day appointed for the fight with wild beasts, Maturus, Sanctus, Attalus, and Blandina were led into the amphitheatre to be torn to pieces by them. Maturus and Sanctus now underwent a second time a repetition of all the same tortures as on the former occasion, just as if they had suffered nothing before, and whatever torments the mob called for were inflicted on them. At last, when they had been scourged and torn by wild beasts, and tortured in every conceivable way, they were placed upon an iron chair, which was made red hot, so that they were literally roasted alive, while the fumes of their own scorching flesh almost suffocated them. In this position they expired, and thus, after having fought and conquered nobly, they won the glorious crown of immortality. Blandina, meanwhile, being bound and hung up on a stake, was exposed as food to the wild beasts. While she was thus hanging, as it were on her cross, she prayed so earnestly that she inspired her fellow sufferers with fresh courage and love, for as they looked at her, they seemed to be contemplating Him who was crucified for them, and her holy joy served to remind them that those who suffer for Christ will forever enjoy communion with Him. But the beasts were less savage than the men who goaded them on, for they refused to touch her, so that after she had hung for some time, she had to be taken down and sent back to prison, to be reserved for another trial. Attalus too was sent back to prison, after he had been led round the amphitheatre amid the shouts and hootings of the brutal mob. For as he was a Roman citizen, the governor would not venture to throw him to the wild beasts without express orders from the emperor. Attalus and Blandina were very sorry to be thus kept waiting, and not at once to have the happiness of dying for Jesus. But our Lord ordered it so from love to those unhappy persons who had forsaken their religion at the beginning of the persecution. These wretched apostates had gained nothing even in this world by their sin, for, though they had been let off at first, yet they had afterwards been seized on various pretences, and had been thrown a second time into prison. They were downcast and hopeless, for they were not supported as the martyrs were, since they knew that their present sufferings were only the beginning of much greater ones which were awaiting them in hell. Attalus and Blandina had been very much grieved at the fall of these apostates, but now, instead of despising them and refusing to have anything to do with them, because they were so wicked, they felt very sorry for them and spoke kindly and gently to them. By these means, these poor sinners were brought back to repentance, so that the love of Jesus revived in their hearts, and they were enabled at their next trial to make a good confession and to recover the glorious crown which they had formerly lost. In course of time, the emperor's answer arrived, and then all the prisoners were led out to be questioned by the governor. A few, but only a very few, denied their faith, and they were at once dismissed. As for the others, those who were Roman citizens were ordered to be beheaded, while the rest were sentenced to be thrown to the wild beasts. When it came to the turn of those who had formerly apostatized, the governor was about to dismiss them after very slight questioning, but they cried out boldly that they were Christians and would not give up their religion, so that they were led away to death with the other martyrs. There happened to be among the crowd a physician called Alexander, a Phrygian, who had been for several years in Gaul, and was well known to the Christians for his love of God and his boldness in speaking the truth. He was not, however, at once recognized by the mob, and thus he was able to stand near the tribunal, and to encourage by signs those who were led up to be questioned. But he was at last noticed, and when the former apostates made a good confession, the mob cried out that it was Alexander who had made them speak in this way. Then the governor asked him who he was, and he answered that he was a Christian, whereupon he also was condemned to be thrown to the wild beasts. The following day, he and Attalus were led into the amphitheatre, for although Attalus was a Roman citizen and ought to have been beheaded, the governor gave him to the wild beasts in order to please the people, who were very much exasperated against him. Alexander and Attalus now endured all the tortures that the savage cruelty of the mob demanded, and at last their torn and bleeding bodies were placed on the red-hot iron chair. Not a word, or a groan, or any other sound was heard from Alexander, who during all his torments held silent and sweet communion with God. As for Attalus, when he was placed upon the chair and the suffocating fumes rose round him, he said to the surrounding multitude, "Lo, this is to devour men, and you are doing it. But as to us, we neither devour men nor commit any other evil." When he was asked what was the name of God, he answered, "God has no name like a man." They were at last put to death with the sword. On the last day of the games, after all the other martyrs had been dispatched, Blandina and a boy of 15 called Ponticus were brought into the amphitheatre. They had been brought in each preceding day to witness the torments of the rest, and the pagans had tried to force them to swear by their idols. They were now put to the whole round of tortures, but all was in vain. Blandina openly encouraged Ponticus by her words and example, so that he bore the whole bravely, till at length he expired. And then Blandina, who had been like a mother animating her children, and had now seen them all conquer and go to Jesus, hastened herself last of all to his sweet presence. After having been scourged, torn by the beasts, and roasted on the iron chair, she was put into a net and thrown to a wild bull. And finally, after she had been repeatedly tossed by this animal, she too was dispatched by the sword. Even the heathens confessed that no woman had ever endured so many and such great sufferings as she had done. The savage fury of the mob did not cease with the death of their victims. They watched the bodies of the martyrs day and night, lest they should be taken away and buried by their friends. They gnashed their teeth at them, they mocked at them, saying, "Where is now their God?" And, "What good has their religion done them?" They allowed the dogs to gnaw them, and at last, after having abused and insulted them during 6 days, they burned them, and threw their ashes into the river Rhone, in order, as they said, to prevent their resurrection, exclaiming with fearful impiety, "Now we shall see whether they will rise again, and whether their God is able to help them, and to rescue them out of our hands."